Hello and welcome to another episode of my space exploration speedrun. In this episode we'll be setting up Vulcanite production, increasing the power generation for the Navis space, and getting all the resources prepared in Navis orbit for production science. At the beginning of this episode we're just figuring out all the different resources we need to set up the Vulcanite production, and also I didn't bring enough rocket fuel for my personal jetpack, so I placed down a fuel processor to turn the local coal into the processed fuel. So here I'm getting the bots to set up the Volcanite production while I go off and set up all of the oil required. Volcanite requires a decent amount of sulfur. So the first time we set up this production, it won't be having any beacons, but the second time we visit the planet, ideally we'll be setting up iridium production and also adding beacons to the existing builds. Here I'm adding in a warehouse to turn all of the stone and sand that's produced into landfill. I actually placed down the build over a Vulcanite core mine, so I used a grenade there to close the mine so that we can build on top of it. Here I decided to actually focus on making sure that the fuel cells are being supplied to the nuclear facility. I decided that I don't really need a perfect way of counting out the amount of resources that I give to the reactors. So I basically estimate the number of ticks that I want to have between supplying fuel cells. To say I only wanted a tenth of the 1.2 gigawatts, I could supply a 200 second multiplied by 10 timing interval. So here I start placing down a blueprint, but then I realized that I don't really have enough substations to place down. So I cancel all of that and then I add spacing for the small power poles. I'm not too worried about maximum production at this point because we're going to be revisiting the planet. At that point we can assess whether or not we need to supply more ore patches to this build. Here, because I actually ran out of underground pipes, I decided to go set up the small amount of iron smelting that I wanted here, just to supply extra belts and pipes that I didn't bring. Just copying one of the columns from Navis. I don't have a proper fuel supply, so I just put down a chest. Here I'm checking what's limiting the Norbit base, and it turns out that because of when I switched the belts, there ended up being a bit of blue science on the rocket science side. I actually have to delete this part of the belt and then pick it up and then place it back down. After the bots replace those items, the logistics supply ends up working properly. So here the Vulcanite build isn't running because we're missing undergrounds for the oil build. Now we've fixed the inserters, and we're also increasing the limits on some of the items that we're requesting. Because we don't have beacons yet, here I'm actually setting all of the machines to have mostly productivity modules, but then one speed module to counteract the slowdown. Here we do a bit of inventory management. We're going to be leaving most of the items we brought with us on this planet. I'm just grabbing out the few items that I want to take back to Navis. We haven't actually researched requested chests yet, so I'm making sure that I know where those chests are at all times. Here I'm connecting the liquid lines for the Volcanite processing, and we've made our first Volcanite block at 14 hours 27. To get rid of the steam, I'm going to use a bunch of steam engines and radars to boil off all of the water. So I need to find a spot in the electrical grid that doesn't connect. Turns out there were actually a few worms there that weren't bothering anyone. So there I just manually put in a few of the delivery pods. Since the first time we visit the planet we'll be using the base level delivery pods, when we come back here a second time we'll be using the iridium ones. Here I'm just grabbing as much of the Vulcanite blocks as I can to bring back with me. And here I'm adjusting the ticks between inserting. Making sure everything's okay before I leave. For some reason the delivery cannon started firing even though it wasn't on automatic mode. Now I have to restock my whole inventory. I'm also checking what resources I need to use to craft the delivery cannon receiver. The most unlucky thing happened. Basically, a meteor hit my nuclear plant. Despite the fact that I have 5 meteor defenses. Here I'm deciding where I want to place down the Volcanite receiver, and I also place the receiver chest a little bit further away from the warehouse, so that even if the receiver chest does get blown up by failing to capture the received items, it doesn't blow up the warehouse. If the Vulcanite production was running at the 2400 a minute, it would take about 40 minutes to fill up the warehouse, but we're not going to get to that level of production till way later in the game. Here I'm diverting some of the iron ore to the iron ingot production, which is used for the production science. We also need a little bit of sand to go with the Volcanite blocks to do Pyroflux production. I decided that I would want to send the half-filled rocket so that we can get science running again, because we really need to start producing as much space platform as we can. So now you can see that the space platform scaffold is researching. So here I'm setting up the Pyroflux production. And now I'm setting up production for the science for productivity module 3. And now my delivery cannon is finally set to target Navis. Now we're focusing on researching all of the other materials that we need. Here I'm buffing up the Pyroflux production. I also grabbed a bunch of Volcanite to put into the tier 3 productivity module assemblers. The idea with this is to try and get all of the tier 3 productivity modules in the science space labs, but we don't end up doing it this episode because the oil build happened to have some requests for the tier 3 prod modules, so I didn't know where they went. So there I just add the iron ingots to share the concrete line that goes up to the rocket. And I realize I actually need to have a line of its own because we're going to be sending Vulcanite blocks up as well. So instead of having the iron concrete line, we now have a iron Vulcanite block line. Just here I'm figuring out how I want to do the crafting setup in space. The most important thing to have crafting set up in space is a manufactory. Some of the machines you can't even craft without a manufactory. There I'm just checking how many spare spaces we have in the warehouses so that I can increase the requests. So we're going to be sending a whole bunch more resources up into space. I basically want the Navis space to be running as much as it possibly can. And now we have a power problem. So here I decide to spend the time to set up the 1.2 gigawatt power for Navis. I dump a bunch of stuff from my inventory and then I decide to grab all of the resources and a bunch of roboports to build it. I figured that I might end up wanting 2 of these, so I try and put them side by side so that I can do the water easily. So here I'm just making sure that the power is supplied so that if I place down roboports to help the bots, they'll actually be powered. After this, I focus on supplying the water. Here I decided I need an assembler that actually produces the pumps. Instead of putting a circuit condition on the Navis power plant, I just let it run. Here I'm trying to pack as many items into the rocket as I can before sending myself up with it. With the space base, we're going to need a lot of space scaffolding, which is the low density structures, heat shielding and steel. While I'm waiting, I decide to actually refurbish the space capsules that I've been using. Whenever you do an emergency burn, you end up burning up the capsule and you need to refurbish it. So I just add in a little spot here to manually fix them. The nice thing about rockets is that with enough research you can actually recycle the whole thing, except for the rocket fuel. So here I'm trying to figure out where my productivity 3s went. I end up using the factory search mod, which allows you to search across the factory, and I found them in the refinery. Here I decide to help out the space base by manually turning the spare robot frames into logistic spots. Now I'm checking what machines I need to actually fill out the space base. So at the moment I'm using this one manufactory and switching the recipes that I'm going to be using, but then I decide that I want to have a manufactory that's always running producing space scaffolding, since it's going to be the main bottleneck that we have in expanding science. We're getting very close to being able to have beacons for everything. So there I was crafting the 4 plasma generators, and now I'm crafting the radiators. It's at this point that I realize that I want to have multiple manufactories around this requester chest, because I have to switch the recipe all the time. It's actually nice to have some assemblers that automatically keep copper cable in the machine and automatically keep the space pipes in the machine. So this is when I decide to move where the chest sits. Now I'm crafting the supercomputers, so we need 5 of these. And here I'm trying to lay out the next crafting setup. Hopefully next time I'll have this all planned out. Now we have 2 manufactories sitting around this, and we have a spot for 2 extra assemblers on the side. Now I'm resetting all of the requests on the request warehouse. Here I decide to actually grab all of the items out of the ship, since we might as well sit them in the warehouse and make sure that we're using all the machines that we do have available. Now I'm just doing the last few sciences that we have available with only the space science. Here I decide to set up a requester that requests all of the barrels in the system to turn them into steel. And then I also put down a passive provider chest so that if any system is requesting steel, it comes from the barrel recycling. Once I have 5 supercomputers, then I go start making some more manufactories. I'm able to use some pipes there to connect the cosmic water required. After someone suggesting it, you could potentially find a really big asteroid and then place down solar on it, in order to get around the fact that you don't have much space scaffolding. So I try and figure out where my pylons are, so that I can do a power line out there. Factory search is very useful for this. I actually changed my mind in building the solar all the way out to the left, and I decided to place down the space scaffolding down below, because this is actually where we're going to eventually have our final science production. So currently we're just going to be moving the power down there, but eventually we'll have all of our science production down there. Here I kind of make a mistake because I actually just replaced all of the requests on the requester. So all of the increases that we added have now been removed. So I should really update the blueprint so that it doesn't replace the requests all the time. We're closing in on the end of the episode soon. Here I'm trying to modify the blueprint to remove the requester part, but apparently you can't do that. I go around trying to satisfy all of the alerts, so we're missing some undergrounds, we're missing some inserters, we're also missing the underground pipes. So I quickly add in some underground belt assemblers. Since the fast inserters are actually used in the recipe of the manufactory, that's the reason why we don't have any in orbit. So I just go around replacing all of the fast inserters with stack inserters. Here I realize that we're missing petroleum for chemical gel and heavy oil for thermofluid, so we quickly add in those two extra fluids to this build that siphons them off of the oil builds. Thankfully early in the run I actually ran two separate lines, so because I already knew that we would have 4 fluids being sent to the rocket. I believe the last fluid to send to the rocket is light oil. Light oil gets used in the observation frames for astronomic science. So here we're placing down more solar because, as I've mentioned before, when you're low on power in orbit or on the ground, the request signal doesn't actually go through. So even though I updated those request signals, the rocket isn't currently being loaded with those items. Just at the end of the episode, we're adding in the copper cable production, and we're also adding in the space pipe production. And then we'll add a little bit of extra power to finalize the episode where the requester actually sends the signal down to the rocket. And we'll start loading up those extra fluids that we were missing. So here I'm changing the module layout of the rocket science, making sure that we're keeping up with the consumption. One of the limitations of this layout is that I'm actually limited by the power pole. So I figure out that I can actually use the power pole of this ship, which gives me a pretty significant area that I can place down solar panels. And at the end of the episode we're just reclaiming the power poles that we didn't end up using. We're most likely just going to keep expanding at the main base, instead of trying to use one of the asteroids. Next time we'll be setting up production science, and hope you enjoyed. Thank you for watching.